next panel is making their way up, I do want to reinforce some of what Leslie said. As budgets shrink at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level, this is really the only opportunity you have in many cases of finding funding to be able to do these projects. So I encourage you to look into this possibility. It is, especially a major project, it is the only way that you can get funding. So I will invite our other panelists up at this time. Brian, good to see you. Alan and Ruth. So you've heard several times today some of the local companies that have done an amazing job. You heard Keith Gabbard talk about his counties. He actually mentioned these counties as well. So we have a distinguished panel that has been very successful in doing local development. And then we have another panelist that has some opportunities for communities going forward. I'm going to give a very brief introduction, and then I'll let them add on to the introduction. But these folks know what the business is all about. Alan Gillum is the CEO and General Manager of East Kentucky Network. You've heard that name several times today. EKN is owned by a consortium of 5 partners, including Coalfields, Foothills, Mountain Rural, Peoples Rural, and Thacker Grigsby. Serves 21 counties in eastern Kentucky, and I hope this number is close. Alan, it may have changed now, but about 375 miles of fiber. You may be more than that now, I'm not certain, but you can correct that one. Ruth Conley is General Manager and CEO of Foothills Communication, and as Keith said, they started this fiber to the premise idea and have done it extremely well. Foothills has been in existence since 1951, and they have done an amazing job of getting fiber to the premise, so we welcome Ruth. And then Brian Mefford. Brian actually has a couple of hats, I think, that he wears today. One is he's president of Open Fiber Kentucky, which is the entity that will be making the connection between the Kentucky wired infrastructure and the retail community as a wholesaler. So Brian will talk about that. And he's also a principal in CNX. I'm going to start out by letting Alan talk about some of the work, and I'll actually just start with closest to me and go across. Let them talk about the work they've done. Think about your questions, because we really do want a question and answer session after they present their information, and we want some good hard questions for them, especially for Alan. So, just kidding.
We're charged here with a real difficult task today. As we talked about preparing for this, I said, how long do we have? And we were kind of given an outline of 10 or 15 minutes each, and then questions and so forth. And I thought, how am I going to cram 2 weeks worth of information into 10 minutes? And that's really how large this thing is. I kind of like to start it out that we're talking about acronyms and so forth. And I remember about 2004, the gentleman in West Liberty at the local newspaper called me one day, and he said, there's these terms in City Hall last night that we're talking about, and he said, I didn't know what they was talking about. He said, is there some way that you could help me to understand the language of this industry? And I said, well, let me think just a minute. I got to figure out where to start. And I said, I got quiet a minute, and I reached in my desk drawer, and there's a dictionary that's called Newton's Telecom Dictionary. And I opened it up, and I looked at how many pages there was in that book. And I said, Earl, I've got Newton's Telecom Dictionary here, and it's the April edition this year, and it's got 932 pages of nothing but acronyms and telecom terms. What page do you want me to start on? And so it's literally that complicated, that complex, and it changes rapidly every year, as does the technology. Uh, I know that it takes so much capital. Capital is the number one thing. The amount of money that it takes to build out a communications infrastructure is just tremendous. And it's hard to find a business case that you can make profitable in rural America, whether it's rural eastern Kentucky or Iowa or Texas. The state matters not. I'm going to share this to help put it in perspective, and I've debated on whether to or not. I don't mean for this to be anything to discourage you. I will mean for it to be for you to get it into real terms, to really understand what you've got to accomplish. Now, it's doable, but now if you don't understand, then you're going to end up in trouble, in a mess, and you're going to end up broke and not able to pay for it. In 1934, the United States passed the Telecom Act of 1934, and it said by law that throughout the United States of America, that every citizen was entitled to similar telephone service at similar cost throughout the nation. And what that meant was, I don't care how remote you were in Arizona or in Kentucky or in Montana, the local telephone provider was obligated to build a line to your place and provide you service by federal law. Now, it was a monopoly and it was regulated, but what they did that they're not sharing openly very well across this nation is Congress charged the FCC with developing a regulatory platform that made this happen. Now, they had all kinds of options in how to do it, and they might do it one way for a decade and change it and do it different the next and change it and do it different the next. But to really sum it up, what's taken place in voice telephone service in rural America across the United States since 1934 is this. There's been a regulatory methodology that when you're given service in high-cost areas, to provide service in some of those western states on telephone lines, there was less than one subscriber per mile. And in Mountain Telephone's territory, there was about 15,000 subscribers for 3,000 route miles of cable. That's about 5 1/4 subscriber per mile. And when you get into metropolitan America, I mean, you're dealing literally with hundreds of subscribers per mile. So the cost model in rural America, when you talk about fiber cable, copper cable, the cost per subscriber is so much more in rural America than it is in metropolitan America. And what took place for years and years and years was, whether it be Mountain Telephone in Kentucky or whether it be a private-owned telephone company in Montana or anywhere in this rural America that you had cost that was real high, there was a methodology in place by the FCC to help you recover your cost. Otherwise, it would have cost so much per subscriber they could never have paid the bill, and there would not have been telephone service there. And that's why it wasn't there in 1934. It was being built out in metropolitan America and not in rural America. Why did cable TV get built out in metropolitan America and not rural America? It got built out there because there never was a regulatory model to give any cost recovery. You had to make a profit off of what you collected from the subscribers you served. There was no method in the regulatory methodology to bring that to be. So I think you're going to find that when you look at rural areas, that the cost to build and maintain a network for 10 years, 20 years is going to be more than you can actually collect from your subscribers for that service. There's going to have to be other revenue streams come from somewhere. It might come out of the federal government, it might come out of state government, it might come out of county government, it might come out of city government. Ultimately, it comes out of the citizens of the United States. But the point I'm trying to make to you is this: the cost model that we've had telephone service under for years was one that in metropolitan America, where the cost per subscriber was low, the FCC, by regulation, moved cost recovery funds. They collected funds from low-cost areas, put it into a pool, and then turned around and gave assistance to the high-cost areas. That's how we did this for about 75 years from 1934 coming forward. And this information is normally not set out and provided in a simple manner like that, but it's still in place today. the small rural telcos that had the right kind of circumstances that regulatory would give them some cost recovery have been able to do great things. But had they not been in that regulatory environment, they would have struggled to have been able to provide this. So I wanted to kind of lay that out. I think that's valuable to you. Now, everybody needs broadband, and I want everybody to have broadband, but I think you got to really look at your cost per subscriber over the long term to retire that debt, to maintain it, cover all your costs, and you're going to find it's going to be very difficult. You're going to have some revenue streams more than you can collect on a monthly bill for service in areas where that you serve two to 10 subscribers per mile. That's what you're going to find. So I decided I'd bring that point out and then turn this over to these other folks to talk. My cord's too short, it won't reach.
Good afternoon. Like they said, I'm with Foothills. We're actually Foothills Rural Telephone Cooperative. We were established in 1951. We've been around a few years. In case anybody has a question, I wasn't with the company at that time. I did come a little bit later. I wasn't part of that. But we provided telephone service only for several years, well, quite a few years actually. We actually do business now as Foothills Communications, because I think somebody had mentioned that earlier, that we do quite a few things more than just telephone service the way that it used to be. But we actually got into internet in the early 90s, well, mid-90s. We started doing dial-up. I'm sure most people's heard of dial-up, if you're my age anyway. But we did that for about 5 years. Actually started looking at DSL. I think a lot of companies actually did DSL over the copper that we had. We did that in 2000, started working on it, and in 2002 we started looking at fiber to the home. It took us a couple of years to try to make a rate case for it and to decide whether or not we would be able to actually have it be sustainable. We actually even had one consultant that came in, did a study for us, told us probably wouldn't do it if they were us. So we stepped back, we refigured some things and looked at how can we build this to get as much revenue as we can as we go forward to help pay for everything else that we're doing. So we came up with a plan that we would build our most populous areas first, which I guess is what most people would do. And we built 5 miles around from each of our wire centers. We have 3 counties actually in eastern Kentucky. I guess I should say that. Magoffin, Johnson, and Lawrence County. We provide service to all of Magoffin County, but we only have the rural areas of Johnson and Lawrence County because AT&T actually provides service to the county seats of both of those, Louisa and Paintsville. And so that's why we were even established, was because the local people out in the rural areas couldn't get service. AT&T didn't want to build to them. But anyway, so we looked at our plan. We thought, okay, if we start with one and roll through with the rest of those, how much money can we borrow? We actually did go to RUS. We presented it to them, borrowed quite a bit of money. We had some other funds that we had loans for, and we rolled all of that together and said, okay, let's just go for it. So we rolled out, started building in the end of 2003. And as Keith had said earlier, 2004, December, November timeframe, we actually did some test customers and some employees. And January of 2005, we actually rolled out fiber to the home at the time, and we're the first company in Kentucky to do that. Since then, we have, well, there's good things about doing it first, and there's bad things about doing it first. When you do it first, there's not a lot of choices out there. We only had a few technologies, available to us. There's many more now than there was back then, and it costs a lot more. So what we build today is much cheaper and which isn't cheap, but is actually much cheaper than what we built when we did it. Hence, why it took us a little longer than Keith. We spent a little more at the beginning. We just had to work that and get the revenue as we could, pay it down as we could, and then keep building as we could. Yeah. And as of today, we have 98% of our customers built to. We're currently building, we're about 80% done with the last 300 customers. So we have around 13,000 customers that are on fiber today. Well, 12,000 that are on fiber today, but 13 that we've built to. So just over time, we've had to slowly, you know, like I said, maybe do it a little bit different, but we have gotten there. We've changed the way we do it. Excuse me.
3 times.
In a lot of ways. We started out one way, and now we kind of do it, you know, a little bit differently. But we have also, because Paintsville is less than a mile from our main office, we have had those county officials, city officials come to us and ask us for service, and is there any way we can provide service to them? Several years back, we actually built to the Board of Education in the county there in Paintsville. We created a CLEC. I'm sure everybody, we've talked about that today. And so we have a subsidiary that's a CLEC that actually provides that service to the schools. We also had the hospital come to us, and when they changed some government rules or things with what they had to do with their records and everything exchange, they needed higher speeds than what they could get and what was available to them there. So we agreed, and we built that to them as well. We've had since the 911 service there. Oh, we also built to all of the hospital's auxiliary offices after we got the main hospital. So we've just done some small builds at that time, but we are now about 80% built out in an overbuild in Paintsville that we hope to start cutting customers over in the next couple of months. And then hopefully we'll be able to move on into Louisa, into the next county as well. So that's where we're at with it today, and hope to just go forward slowly as we can and do whatever we can with it.
Out those 12,000 customers, and then what's your estimated monthly revenue? Oh, sorry. Ms. Conley, can you give us an estimated total cost and what that build out was for those 12,000 customers? And then what's your recurring revenue on that monthly, just per customer?
Okay, we have a lot of really rural areas. Those were the areas that we did last. And we have around a little over $70 million invested, at least. The annual revenue, let's see, I'm trying to think on, with all of the services and everything, we're around $30 million a year. But then we also have a lot of expenses that go along with that too. But we are definitely seeing a better, the repair, fiber is so much more durable than copper, lasts so much longer. Our trouble tickets are down, we definitely are seeing that now. We're seeing the effects of that.
I could share quickly kind of general terms on the total investment at Mountain Telephone, where it involved about 15,000 subscribers scattered through 4 counties, a little bit more territory than what Foothills had. And the total investment there made over quite a number of years. The last mile investment alone was $78 million. But then prior to that, getting the middle mile part and everything ready to do the last mile was probably close to 40. So it's probably close to $120 million invested in the fiber to the home in those 4 counties that Mountain Telephone has.
Everybody sober now? These kind of figures? As Mr. Gabbard said, 10 minutes. I want to try to make the best use of your time in my allotted 10 minutes here. And I'm thinking about what's been said by the speakers here before me, and going back to Leslie, I mean, she made a point that I'll paraphrase. You know, she said, you know, basically the math has to work.
It's got to work.
And so what you've just heard here from the absolute experts in the country, it ain't easy to make the math work. But there are ways to get there. Yep. So I'll back up a step and say I've spent the past 15 years of my career doing broadband planning and mostly in rural areas. Peggy Satterley and I can tell war stories from years and years ago, talking about broadband before broadband was really a term, and the Appalachian Regional Commission had begun prioritizing it. But through Connected Nation and now with CNX, we continue to do some community broadband planning. Recently, or in the past, some of you were involved in the Sky FM project, Southern Kentucky Final Mile project. Clay, Knott, Perry, Letcher, and Leslie counties were involved in that. And I mentioned that project to say that it's interesting, having done that project, and those never end until, you know, there's broadband that gets provided to the homes throughout that county. But when you look at each of those counties, after the math was worked out and we looked at different approaches, the point I would make about that project is that each county then sort of chose the approach that fits them the best. And that's not to say you can't have a regional approach, but if it's a regional approach, it has to be something that fits your region. Whether it's, you know, 2 counties, 5 counties, 10 counties, 1 county, it has to fit your region, your community. So as an example, in some of those communities, they said, well, our priority and the way we're going to get this snowball rolling down the hill is to focus on our, you know, what we call community anchor institutions, anchor tenants. If they were in a shopping mall, are big, heavy users and our economic development drivers in our county. That's where we're going to focus. So instead of the math, you know, being 70 million or 100 million, they said, well, we're not ready to bite that off yet. Let's back down to just those anchor tenants and let's cost that out and see how we can make that math work. There's a group out of Alabama called Southern Light, and I've been spending quite a bit of time with them, and they call that approach building to create broadband beachheads. And so that's a way to get fiber into your community, perhaps out in areas that it wouldn't have been otherwise. Let me say that sort of just almost as an aside, but philosophically, our approach to broadband planning has always been private-public, meaning that we want to see how much we can entice and support the private sector to invest out as far and extend their networks out as far as they possibly can. And then at that point, we have to get more creative and say, okay, what are the partnership opportunities, or what are the ways that the public sector then can be a supporter and a partner in extending that investment out further. And as already been said, that may be, it could be a variety of things, but helping go secure grant funds, providing, being an anchor tenant. So local government can be an anchor tenant to a private company that's interested in building broadband in your community. So that lowers their risk if the local government is able to bring customers, particularly power users, you would call them, to the equation. So it's things like that start help making the math work. Then there are other counties, even in those 5 I mentioned earlier, where they say, okay, we have a particular area of growth in the county, and we're going to do this in a phased approach, and we're going to start with our highest growth effort or growth areas first. And we see that sort of take root. And if you were using Leslie's public-private partnership approach she mentioned earlier, that can be phased that way, so that then, you know, you're working in the first area, you're generating revenue for the project by committing to that particular area, And as that takes root and gets legs, then you can start building through other parts of your county or communities. So let me shift. Lonnie mentioned I'm wearing a couple hats. That sort of represents the CNX hat that I'm wearing today. From an open fiber Kentucky standpoint, and this is more important probably than what I just said, but as a key part of this Kentucky Wired initiative, and I have to always use this disclaimer to say, I get the benefit of now being involved in a project where the benefits are going to start being more evident. But Lonnie and his team, we're in the trenches developing this concept so early on, and folks at the state level, and Philip Brown being here today, these are the people making it happen. But we now get the benefit of, I get the benefit of being able to tell you how this is going to impact broadband in your community. So because of partnerships like EKN, the state did the right thing and said, we've got companies that have already been out there making these investments, so let's partner with them and partner as they build out more infrastructure. So the state, though, statewide, as you've heard today, is going to have miles and miles, about 3,200 miles of fiber across the state. The foresight that came, and Lonnie and Larry particularly, saying, okay, as we do that, we're building, we're going to be in the ground once, or we're going to be stringing cable once. Let's overbuild what we need so that we're not only future-proofing for our needs ahead, but that we've got the ability to sell part of that fiber and support needs as companies go to local communities and want to build out further. Now, what that means, bringing it back to the math. Now, again, a big part of my personal planning, broadband planning work has been done in Kentucky over the last 15 years. And granted, broadband at the time when we started was 56K. So the goalposts are always changing. But nonetheless, we've hit lots of brick walls over the years in Kentucky with broadband planning. Why is that? Well, you can have the best companies out in communities with the best intentions and going as absolutely to the max that they can from a return on investment standpoint. You can build the best last mile service plan that exists in the world, but eventually that business plan and that physical network has to connect back to the big internet at some point, and that's what we call transport or backhaul. Well, the problem over the years is you can make the business plan work for last mile, but when there's only one source of getting back to the main internet, and that source is able to charge whatever in the world they want to charge, and that source also has a last mile network in that community, well, they're probably going to charge a bit of a premium, so there's not a competitor, or it just won't provide access to it. So that had to be solved, and that's part of what this Kentucky Wired network is addressing. So to bring that to practical terms, and I was just with an internet service provider this morning who I explained that aspect of this project, the fact that through Open Fiber Kentucky, so that's going to be the wholesale access back to the Kentucky Wired transport network for private companies. So if you're an internet service provider and you want to build out a new community, you'll now have access because there's extra capacity built out, and it's going to be a fraction of the cost that you would see otherwise in the marketplace today. So the math all of a sudden is going to work a bit better than it has in the past. But this conversation, I'll stop here, Lonnie, but this conversation this morning, I was talking to a service provider who said, well, as it turns out, just last week they were saying, said, we have a great plan and we put a proposal in with the county government. We were refused access to transport. It's impossible for us to actually build out that network. So that's what the intent of Open Fiber Kentucky is. And as soon as those fibers start being lit and become accessible, then you as a provider, for those of you in the room who are providers, will have access to that capacity at a much reduced price.
Okay, questions?
Lonnie, I might make a few additional comments, having listened to Ruth and to Brian. This thing is important and it's doable. Realize that, and Leslie made this statement, it's a long-term venture. It's the kind of thing that when you put the fiber in, you're looking at an asset that you're expecting to recoup and pay for over a period of 30 years, not 5. When you put your electronics in, for the most part, you're going to replace that electronics in 5 to 7 years. All right. At Appalachian Wireless, we expect, if we go invest $15 million in new electronics, we expect in 5 years we're going to take it out and replace it with whatever is most current at that time. That's the kind of philosophy that we have to operate on. If we don't, we won't be going forward staying up with the changing technology. But the fiber we've put in the ground, and for additional comment, between the 5 telco partners, Appalachian Wireless together in Eastern Kentucky, we today have well over 6,000 route miles of fiber, not the 375. That's the one fiber ring we've got. Put it all together, and we've got more than 6,000 route miles of fiber. So we really know what it takes to build fiber and maintain it, and it's worth the effort. It's worth the investment. What you get out of it is worth having. But do realize that you're into this thing with something that's going to involve the use by your children or grandchildren, and it's going to be partially paid by them as they use it. So don't think you're going to do this and get it and pay for it in 5 years. That's not going to happen. So you gotta have a long-term vision to make it work. But it's worth working. It's worthwhile.
Ross?
So great segue, I think. So how many telecommunications cooperatives are there in the state of Kentucky, and why aren't you guys expanding? As opposed to coming to us as local officials and community members, why aren't you, who've done it so well, and by the way, I commend you for being in FiOS, or I'm sorry, fiber to the premise back in 2004 as a former executive for Verizon. In other words, why aren't we looking at utility cooperatives too as another option? I mean, it seems to me that we've got cooperatives throughout the state already in existence in these rural areas. Why aren't we leveraging what we've already done as opposed to trying to build new?
I think I can give you a pretty simple and plain answer to that. What most people don't realize, the regulatory framework that I started out talking to you about, the regulatory framework for Foothills, it applies to the original territory that they had when they modified the Telephone Act in 1996. Anytime they go outside the territory, there is no cost recovery. It only applies within that defined territory that existed in 1996. So you got a totally different financial model inside the ILEC area versus outside. That's the reason.
And I think it's, just a second, I think it's important to understand too, the difference between rural and urban. In urban areas, you've got a population base that it's easy to go in there. That's why the privates have gone in there, and they can do it very, very easily if you've got the population base. In a lot of our rural areas, you cannot, if you actually sat down and tried to build a business case for it, you can't build a business case. As Alan said, you can't pay it back just on the revenues you're going to generate from it. So unless you find some other funding methods, you're not going to be able to build it. You take that to a bank and see how far you get on trying to borrow money on a business case in some of these rural areas just because you don't have the population base. So you've got to find creative ways of doing it a different manner. Larry?
Yeah, with the Kentucky Wired project, we're building literally a statewide network. But this question kind of has to do with the difference between that versus an actual internet connection. So say, for example, I am a local internet provider or a local government entity, and I'm looking to get some kind of service in, say, in Somerset or in one of these rural areas. If I attach into the Kentucky Wired network, would I also then have to negotiate a peering point, say in Cincinnati, in other words, do I get internet service through the Kentucky Wired network as a local internet service provider, or do I just extend my arm to where I can reach an internet service that I would have to then peer into in Cincinnati or Louisville?
And actually, I'm going to ask Brian to tackle this one, because this is exactly what Brian is going to be doing through Open Fiber Kentucky.
Yeah, I was just looking at Larry because I was thinking he's standing right there. He can answer it too.
You think Larry loaded that question?
He was the earliest expert on that point. No, you'll be able to have lit services off that network as an internet service provider. The idea is that then that's how you're able to build a business case and extend out services in Somerset and Pulaski County.
You have peerings, or you're going to have peerings that are large enough to handle the capacity of all of your customers to peer out to interstate and global networks then?
Larry, have at it. Yes. Yes is the answer.
Yes, and yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, the answer is yes. With a transport network, you're going to be able to hop on to Kentucky Wired at any point and hop off at any point. So, you know, if while you're here you get to talking with Keith and you like the kind of internet service that he's providing, and you want to have that extended, 20 counties away, Kentucky Wired is one of those ways where you can hop on in your county and hop off in Jackson County and buy services from Keith or from Alan or from anybody, and be able to bring those into your local area. It's also a way for you to connect businesses, and this is the exciting part for Lonnie and I, is if you've got banking concerns that have got offices all over Kentucky, this is a way for them to connect their offices together and then buy their internet off of one provider instead of having to overbuy from 6 different providers.
And Larry, perfect. And I just, for the sake of clarity, you prefaced your question as an internet service provider. I don't want to risk any confusion. Kentucky Wired, Open Fiber Kentucky has no plans to be the service provider out to a home. The point is that still relies on a private provider or a cooperative, those who are experts in providing that kind of consumer service to do so.
I had a question about, again, a municipal utility getting into, essentially building a last mile network, new to the industry, but we see the need in our community, but also hear that Kentucky Wired has wholesale access that's going to be for sale, and what's to keep an incumbent provider to essentially get the same access we do, and they're already in the business and could really make us hard to be competitive, essentially. And we could take the risk and go in debt and try to get into the business, and then sometime shortly after that kind of be undercut or make the pie a little smaller for us. Can you speak to what your intentions are of how you're going to control and what the decision mechanism is going to be about how you're going to give access along those lines?
So it is truly open fiber. So there won't be a limitation, to who can get access to it. So there's the prices ultimately are going to be the same for whoever's coming to get access to it. Given they're situated similarly. But yeah, I mean, to be clear, if you're going to serve, if you're going from A to B and the price for that is going to be X, then the next person, the next company that comes going from the same point A to the same point B, it's going to still be, price still going to be X. So, I mean, what that tells me is there's first mover advantage, certainly. There's also local advantage. We just see, that when a service is being provided local, that's your best competitive strength. And I come from over in the other part of the state, and we have local. So I'm from Warren County, and Bowling Green Municipal Utility provides a great enterprise-grade service, commercial service So you can imagine they have, that same concern. A couple things. Again, they're local. They've been providing that service. The ability for somebody else to come in there and compete with them on the same terms is just not that great. It also expands their pie across the county, because this network is going to go out to endpoints that are in parts of the county that haven't seen fiber ever and wouldn't otherwise. So they're going to be able to pull off that, tap into that, and provide access to new customers.
Did that answer your question?
Not, I don't know that we have enough to even base that on, because we've been waiting to have more progress on the network, honestly, but before we go out and have a lot of those conversations. They haven't been busting the door down. I will say that. And I don't mean to overstep it. When Hilda, you've got that microphone there, but Philip.
Let's stand here.
Philip is running the show at Kentucky Wired, so if you. You're doing great.
He doesn't want back up here.
Yeah, I'd just make a comment. Joe's your dad.
Yes, sir.
And I met him in Monticello a few years ago, and I'm very pleased to know that he is interested in high-speed internet to gain more speeds and also affordable. So we was on the same page there, and I enjoyed working with him. But as far as this circuit with Kentucky Wired, such as we was paying the phone provider about $8,000 for a 150 meg circuit a month. Yeah, wow. And so on this Kentucky Wired world, we'll still be using this Kentucky Wired network just to connect and compete with a provider at the other end. I think that's what y'all said. Am I right? More or less, the fiber will be like a fiber connectivity, and then we'll still have to negotiate.
Yeah, that's right.
You still have to do the last mile negotiation.
Yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
But hopefully you'll be in a better market to buy.
Well, we did that.
Could I say something about, I think what you had started to say a while ago about why we're not going further out and how many of us there are? I can say the fact that we're a co-op means that we're pretty well nonprofit, and all of our money goes to our members. So therefore, we feel like what we do is for our community, and it's for everybody. So if we have those high revenue customers, say where we're building into these cities that we haven't had before as a CLEC, then that would roll in with, we would put that with our ILEC. Anything that we could do with that, then we want to build out as far as we possibly can. Yeah. Even if those customers themselves don't pay for themselves, we're good to do that. As long as we have the revenue on the backside that can help us to do that, we are more than open and willing to do that. It just takes time, because as long as it's taken us just, with what we're doing. But I do feel like we do it better now than we did when we started, because we've learned a lot of hard lessons, and I can probably give you a bigger list of what not to do than what, is good to do.
That was perfect, Ruth, because I wanted to follow up on Ross's comment as well. So, yes, because they are cooperatives, if you look across the whole country, the best broadband service in all of rural America are in the regions served by telephone cooperatives and independents, small family, usually family-owned telephone companies. They do the best anywhere. And I want to mention, like Keith and Ruth, of how they've been able to step outside of that comfort level, that box, because they've had a defined territory. They operate within that. It's been a big leap and a big risk, and they can't jeopardize their financial stability of their lender and their existing customer base to CLEC in. But they have done that, and I really can't say enough good things about that. And so I do hope our communities will look to those folks as potential, which is your suggestion very much. And I'll encourage them, as I see him everywhere, to look at partnering, and encourage them to step outside their comfort zone as a telephone. So into the electric piece, I wanted to follow up. Electric cooperatives, which we have a lot of in rural Kentucky, are all over the country, are providing broadband service, especially when it comes to smart grid, which is now the whole thing they're interested in, meter reading, smart meter reading. They are now, there's a pot of money at RUS for them to do that. It's more money than in the broadband program. You're seeing a lot of it. You're not seeing it in Kentucky. Kentucky's electric co-ops are sort of a double regulated by the State Public Service Commission, and something we might want to look into. But anyway, they have not been as aggressive, and that's one of the reasons they tell me. But I can tell you, Tennessee just passed legislation, Indiana just passed legislation, Georgia's got legislation going through right now that make it easier, and they too have take care of their own members. As a cooperative, they have to always never jeopardize that financial part of their business. But it is an option that folks are looking at and getting much more aggressive into. So I think it's a good thing for our telephone people to get out there and get started on it. And again, I just use this opportunity to laud what these guys are doing. But I wanted to follow up on the electric. Thanks, Lonnie.
Wait for the microphone, sir. Always a troublemaker in the bunch.
Since we're talking about co-ops, I've heard a lot of co-ops started in 1950, maybe 60. When was the last co-op formed in Kentucky in the U.S.? Is it possible to start a new one?
I have no idea.
It-
I don't.
There was a new electric cooperative. But yes, there are cooperatives that are formed all the time. There theoretically could be a cooperative made up of telephone, electrics, municipal, I mean, there are ways to create new cooperatives, and there is a national board. You know the latest telephone cooperative?
I don't, but I do think you can. I just don't know the process.
Yeah.
Of course, we were started in 1950. Yeah. It is a good point. I want to follow up on what Hilda always gives me a hard time for not partnering with the electric co-op. Our company has just been mentioned in the National Telephone Magazine and the National Electric Magazine about some partnerships we have with our local electric co-op.
Yes, they partner, but they don't partner as far as they could partner, is my point. In last mile, not as much as I wanted.
Well, and I think it's interesting that 2 of the 5 EKN companies are co-ops.
Three are co-ops.
Three are co-ops.
Yeah.
Which is the other?
Mountain, Peoples, and Foothills, co-ops.
So 3 of them are co-ops.
And then Coalfields is family-owned, and Thacker Griggs is family-owned. If I might, let me add one more piece to this. We've talked all about wireline, and here I am, the CEO of Appalachian Wireless, and I hadn't talked wireless. But for everybody's information, with it, the ability to send this on fiber is the #1 and ideal. But we're very rapidly moving all across the nation and in spectrum availability and in improving technology. And you no doubt have been hearing over the last 12 months, if you pay attention to trade magazines and newspapers, you're going to start hearing a lot about 5G. We talk about today 4G LTE being excellent wireless service. But the next great generation of it is going to move to what we're going to call 5G. And when we reach that, which is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 10 years in the future before it really starts to become full reality, you'll start seeing pilots done on it and see it starting in some locations probably within 24 months by the Verizons and the AT&Ts and so forth. But the 5G wireless technology is going to be capable of doing tremendous things on speed and broadband in a wireless methodology. However, it will have such large capacity the only way that you can supply it and move it from the base station that you put out here back, you must have fiber run to that base station. You can't run it on microwave, you can't run it on anything else because you don't have the ability to transport that capacity. So it's critical that the fiber network continues to develop and be taken out to everybody. But simultaneously with that, if you try to look over the next decade, you're also going to find next great strides in bandwidth and broadband on wireless as well.
And that's to your point. I wanted to say that earlier, but I didn't want to interrupt. I think that is where we will get some of these big boys is on their wireless component, their cellular component, because they need that backhaul. So, one more.
If it takes 30 years to pay for fiber to the premise, and you think in 10 years wireless, if it takes 30 years to pay for wireless to the premise, and you think in 10 years you're going to have wireless that makes it as good as having, can you make it pay out fast enough?
My personal belief and opinion, and that's all it is, anybody who looks into the future, you're guessing, but I think that the citizens of the United States, what we will want to do, need to do, desire to do, and benefit by doing will become so great in capacity, in data and information, that we'll need both. We'll use both.
I agree, because data is becoming a big issue. I mean, a lot bigger than most folks realize. The amount of data that is flowing through these lines, and it's increasing rapidly every single day. So I agree with you. I have one last question that I want to ask Ruth, and I don't mean to put you on the spot. We've heard several instances where communities have 98, 99, 100% penetration or access availability, but their take rates, the amount of people that are actually on the service are in the high 50s, low 60% range. I think you told us you're 73, 74% take rate. How do you get to that point? Is it through an education process, or how do you get your take rate? So,
I don't really know that we did anything different, extra. What we focus on is having good service and trying to make it as affordable as we possibly can, and as solid as we can as well. And I guess that's one of the things I would like to point out, though, about having redundancy, not only on a ring that if you have a break, it goes, in a different direction, but you also have two paths out to the world. Because if you only have one, that goes down anywhere because equipment can go down. And if that equipment goes down, you're out for a while. Okay, 1 hour is all it takes. Lights up Facebook in an hour you're crucified practically. I mean, it's horrible. But, and it only takes 10 minutes. If it's off 10 minutes, literally, you will have people on Facebook saying their internet's off, what's going on. And because they know it instantly. You can also have some other things set up, but you definitely would want to have, and what we've tried to do and we've worked really hard to do, is to make sure that we have a north path and a south path. So we have one way out in the north, and then we also have one way out in the south. We also have what we call peering. We actually connect in Chicago. We peer in Chicago with, we have a Netflix server at our office as well, because that uses a ton of bandwidth. But we also peer, and we're friends with Facebook, Apple, Netflix for anything that's not on our server. A couple of others, Matthew would have to remind me, I can't remember them all. But that actually saves a lot of things on bandwidth as well. So you don't just pay for what you're paying for with this ring and for that fiber, you also have to pay somebody else to get it out to the world to you. So that's also an expense and part of that as well, unless you have somebody that provides both. And so we've worked really hard just to try to get all of that set up so that way if one side goes down, one set of equipment goes down, if there's a national disaster in the Chicago area, then we roll to Atlanta. So, but we have to have double the capacity that we need, because if one side goes down, we always have that other one up and going. So that's what we've been doing.
I can tell you from experience, that's a hard lesson. We've had that with KCTCS. Those proverbial squirrels that you were talking about, Keith. Let's please thank our panelists for being here.